The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that made the hum of Judge Evelyn Carter's sedan seem louder than usual. She had just left a late meeting at the courthouse, her mind still replaying the day's cases. The glow of the dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m., and the empty stretch of road ahead promised a quick drive home. Evelyn adjusted her rear-view mirror, catching a glimpse of her tired but determined expression. She was no stranger to long hours, but tonight exhaustion tugged at her shoulders. As she approached the outskirts of the small town of Crestwood, the flashing red and blue lights appeared in her mirror. Evelyn frowned, glancing at her speedometer. She was driving 5 miles under the limit. Still, she signaled and pulled over, her hands resting calmly on the wheel. 2 officers approached her car, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The taller one, Officer Daniels, tapped on her window with a knuckle. Evelyn rolled it down, meeting his gaze with the steady composure of someone who had spent years presiding over tense courtrooms. License and registration, Daniels said, his tone clipped. Evelyn reached for her glove compartment. But before she could retrieve the documents, the second officer, Harris, leaned in. "You know why we pulled you over?" "No, officer, I don't," Evelyn replied, evenly handing over her license and registration. Daniel studied her license, his flashlight casting harsh shadows on his face. "This your car?" "Yes, it is," Evelyn said, her patience unwavering. Harris smirked, his eyes scanning the interior of her car. "You're a long way from home, ma'am. What brings you out here this late?" "I was at work," Evelyn replied. "I'm heading home." "Work, huh?" Daniel said, his tone dripping with skepticism. "What kind of work?" "I'm a judge," Evelyn said, her voice firm. The officers exchanged a glance, a flicker of amusement passing between them. "A judge, huh?" Harris repeated, his smirk widening. "You don't say." Evelyn's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. She knew this game all too well. Daniels stepped closer, his flashlight lingering on her face. "Step out of the car, ma'am." Evelyn's heart rate quickened, but she complied, opening the door and standing with her hands visible. The cool night air bit at her skin as Harris began patting her down, his hands rough and invasive. "You got any weapons on you?" Daniels asked, his tone accusatory. "No," Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the indignity of the situation. "We'll see about that," Harris muttered, continuing his search. As the officers rifled through her car, Evelyn stood on the side of the road, her mind racing. She knew what this was, racial profiling, plain and simple. She had seen it in her courtroom countless times, but experiencing it firsthand was a different kind of anger. Finally, Daniels turned to her, holding up a small vial he'd found in her glove compartment. "Care to explain this?" Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "That's not mine." "Sure it's not," Harris said with a laugh. "You're under arrest." As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Evelyn's resolve hardened. She would play their game for now. But she knew one thing for certain, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The fluorescent lights of the Crestwood Police Department buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, unflattering glow on the dingy walls of the holding area. Judge Evelyn Carter sat on a cold metal bench, her hands resting in her lap, her posture straight despite the indignity of her situation. The handcuffs had been removed, but the sting of their grip lingered on her wrists, a physical reminder of the injustice she had endured. Across the room, Officers Daniels and Harris leaned against a desk, their voices carrying through the sparse space. They were laughing, their tones laced with a smugness that made Evelyn's stomach churn. "You should have seen her face when we cuffed her," Harris said, chuckling. "Tried to act all high and mighty, like she was above it." "Yeah, well, she's not so tough now," Daniels replied, glancing in Evelyn's direction. "Just another troublemaker trying to act innocent." Evelyn kept her gaze forward, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. She had spent years on the bench, listening to testimonies, observing body language, and deciphering the truth behind words. She knew their type, overconfident, emboldened by their badges, and utterly unaware of the consequences of their actions. A younger officer, barely out of his 20s, approached the holding cell with a clipboard. He avoided eye contact with Evelyn as he spoke. "Ma'am, we need to process your information. Full name, please." "Evelyn Carter," she said, her voice calm but firm. The officer scribbled on his clipboard, then paused. "Occupation." "Judge," Evelyn replied, her tone unwavering. The young officer's head snapped up, his eyes widening. "Judge." Before Evelyn could respond, Harris sauntered over, snatching the clipboard from the rookie. "Don't let her fool you, kid. She's just trying to scare you." Evelyn met Harris's gaze, her expression unflinching. "I don't need to scare anyone, officer. The truth speaks for itself." Harris smirked, leaning closer to the bars. "You think you're special, huh? Well, in here, you're just like everyone else." Evelyn leaned back, her lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. "We'll see about that." As the night dragged on, Evelyn listened to the officers' conversations, her sharp mind cataloging every detail. They spoke openly, their words laced with racial slurs and derogatory remarks about the community they were supposed to serve. They bragged about other arrests, laughing at the misfortune of those they deemed beneath them. At one point, Daniels approached the cell, his arms crossed. "You know, you could make this easier on yourself. Just admit you had the drugs, and we might go easy on you." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, her voice steady. "I don't negotiate with liars." Daniels's face reddened, but he said nothing, retreating to the safety of his desk. As the hours passed, Evelyn's mind raced. She thought about the countless individuals who had sat in this very cell, their voices silenced by a system that favored power over justice. She thought about the officers' arrogance, their belief that they were untouchable. And she thought about the small dash cam in her car, quietly recording every moment of the traffic stop. When the first light of dawn began to creep through the narrow windows, Evelyn closed her eyes, a quiet resolve settling over her. She had spent her career upholding the law, ensuring fairness and accountability. Now, it was her turn to demand the same. The officers might have thought they had won, but Evelyn knew better. This was just the beginning. The Crestwood Courthouse was a modest building, its aging facade a stark contrast to the modern, bustling courthouse Evelyn Carter usually presided over. She sat in the defendant's chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression calm but resolute. The morning sunlight streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows across the wooden benches of the courtroom. A handful of spectators, mostly court staff and a few curious locals, filled the seats, their murmurs creating a low hum in the air. Officers Daniels and Harris stood near the prosecutor's table, their uniforms crisp, their demeanors confident. They exchanged quiet jokes, their laughter barely concealed. To them, this was just another routine case, another notch on their belts. They hadn't bothered to review the details of the arrest, too assured of their victory to prepare. The bailiff entered, his voice booming through the room. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Carter." The room fell silent as the door behind the bench opened. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her face composed, her eyes fixed forward. She didn't need to look at the officers to know their reactions. The sharp intake of breath, the muttered curse, the sudden shift in energy, it was all unmistakable. Judge Evelyn Carter stepped onto the bench, her black robe flowing behind her. She adjusted her glasses, her gaze sweeping the room before settling on the two officers. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Daniels's face paled, his confident smirk replaced by a look of sheer panic. Harris froze, his clipboard slipping from his hands and clattering to the floor. The sound echoed through the silent courtroom, drawing the attention of everyone present. Evelyn took her seat, her voice calm but commanding. "You may be seated." The room obeyed, the creak of chairs and shuffling of feet filling the air. Evelyn opened the case file in front of her, her movements deliberate. She could feel the weight of the officers' stares, their unease palpable. "Case number 2479, she began, her tone even. The State versus Evelyn Carter. Charges include possession of a controlled substance and resisting arrest." She looked up, her eyes locking onto the officers. Officers Daniels and Harris. You are the arresting officers in this case, correct? Daniels cleared his throat, his voice shaky. Yes, Your Honor. Evelyn nodded, her expression unreadable. Officer Daniels, please take the stand. As Daniels approached the witness stand, his usual swagger was gone, replaced by hesitant steps. He swore the oath, his voice barely above a whisper, and sat down, his hands gripping the edge of the wooden rail. Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her gaze piercing. Officer Daniels, please describe the events leading up to the arrest of the defendant. Daniels glanced at Harris, then at the prosecutor, who gave him an encouraging nod. He began his testimony, his words carefully chosen but laced with inconsistencies. He claimed Evelyn had been speeding, that she had been uncooperative, that the drugs had been in plain sight. Evelyn listened intently, her expression neutral. When he finished, she opened a folder and pulled out a photograph. Officer Daniels, do you recognize this? He squinted at the image, his face draining of color. It was a still from her dashcam, clearly showing her car parked legally, her hands visible on the wheel, and the officers approaching aggressively. I don't recall, Daniels stammered. Evelyn's lips curved into a faint smile. Let me refresh your memory. The courtroom held its breath as the truth began to unravel. The courtroom air crackled with tension as Judge Evelyn Carter fixed her gaze on Officer Daniels, the dashcam photo trembling in his hand. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, the image betraying his fabricated testimony. Evelyn leaned forward, her voice slicing through the silence. Officer Daniels, your report states the defendant was aggressive and attempted to flee. Yet this photo shows her vehicle stationary, engine off, and her hands visible. Would you care to explain the discrepancy? Daniels' eyes darted to the prosecutor, who rose half-heartedly. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. Overruled, Evelyn said, her tone leaving no room for debate. The witness will answer. Daniels shifted in his seat, sweat glistening at his temples. I must have misremembered. It was a high-stress situation. Misremembered. Evelyn repeated the word slowly, as if tasting its dishonesty. She turned to the bailiff. Play the dashcam footage time-stamped 11:52 p.m. The screen behind the bench flickered to life. Officers Daniels and Harris loomed into view, their flashlights piercing the car's interior. Evelyn's calm voice echoed through the speakers. I'm a judge. Harris's sneering reply followed. A judge? Huh? You don't say. Laughter, sharp and derisive, rang out as the video cut to Harris's invasive pat-down and Daniels brandishing the planted vial. The courtroom erupted in gasps. A juror covered her mouth. A reporter in the back row began scribbling furiously. Evelyn paused the footage, freezing on Harris's smirk. Officer Daniels, is this how you handle high-stress situations, by fabricating evidence and mocking citizens? Daniels opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. Harris, still at the prosecutor's table, gripped the edge so hard his knuckles whitened. Evelyn retrieved another file. Your personnel records show 3 prior complaints of racial profiling, all dismissed due to insufficient evidence. She turned to the gallery, addressing the room. But evidence exists here. The defendant's vehicle was searched without consent, her rights violated, and a false narrative constructed to justify an illegal arrest. She motioned to the bailiff again. The audio resumed, this time capturing the officer's conversation after her arrest, a snippet from the holding cell, recorded unknowingly by a malfunctioning security mic. Think she'll actually get a lawyer? Harris's voice dripped with mockery. Who'd believe some angry black woman crying racism? Daniels chuckled. The gallery exploded. A community activist stood, shouting shame, until the bailiff restored order. Evelyn waited, her stillness a counterpoint to the chaos. Your Honor, the prosecutor tried weakly. This evidence wasn't disclosed. Because the officers never filed it, Evelyn interrupted. A violation of discovery rules and ethical duty. She turned to the defense table, her table, where her court-appointed lawyer sat stunned, moved to dismiss all charges. The lawyer jolted upright, Yes, Your Honor. The defense moves for dismissal with prejudice. Evelyn's gavel struck once, sharp as a gunshot. Granted, the charges are dismissed. She leveled her gaze at Daniels and Harris, now shrunk into their seats. As for the officers, this court refers them for criminal investigation and suspends their authority pending its outcome. Bailiffs escort them from the premises. Daniels lurched up, voice cracking. Your Honor, please. You'll address the court with respect, Evelyn snapped, or face contempt. As the bailiffs approached, Harris shot her a venomous glare. You think you've won? This isn't over. Evelyn removed her glasses, her eyes glacial. No, Officer Harris. For you, it's just begun. The gavel fell again, its echo a death knell to their careers. Reporters surged forward, cameras flashing, as Evelyn exited the bench. In the hallway, she paused, steadying herself against the wall. The victory was hollow, the system's rot laid bare. But today, at least, it had bent toward justice. Tomorrow, she'd ensure it broke no one else. The media frenzy that followed the dismissal of the case was relentless. Headlines blared. Judge exposes racist cops in stunning courtroom showdown. Clips of the dashcam footage went viral, sparking nationwide outrage and calls for police reform. But for Judge Evelyn Carter, the fight was far from over. She sat in her chambers, the morning sunlight streaming through the windows, illuminating the stacks of case files and legal briefs on her desk. Her phone buzzed incessantly, reporters requesting interviews, activists seeking her support, colleagues offering their congratulations. She ignored them all, her focus on the task at hand. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Come in, she called, not looking up. Her clerk, a young woman named Maya, entered hesitantly. Judge Carter, the press is still camped outside. They're asking for a statement. Evelyn sighed, setting down her pen. Tell them I'll issue one later today. Right now, I need to prepare for the hearing. Maya nodded but lingered. Judge, are you sure about this? Going after the department directly? It's going to be a fight. Evelyn met her gaze, her expression resolute. It's always been a fight, Maya. The only difference is now, I'm not fighting alone. The hearing in question was a landmark case, one Evelyn had fast-tracked to address systemic misconduct within the Crestwood Police Department. She had subpoenaed internal records, body cam footage, and witness testimonies, compiling a damning dossier of racial profiling, evidence tampering, and abuse of power. As she entered the courtroom, the buzz of anticipation was palpable. The gallery was packed, community members, activists, and journalists all vying for a seat. Officers Daniels and Harris sat at the defense table, their faces drawn and pale. Their lawyer, a seasoned litigator with a reputation for defending police misconduct, looked equally uneasy. Evelyn took her seat on the bench, her presence commanding silence. This court is now in session, she announced. We are here to address the systemic issues within the Crestwood Police Department as evidenced by the conduct of Officers Daniels and Harris and the department's failure to address prior complaints. The hearing unfolded like a meticulously orchestrated symphony. Evelyn presented evidence with surgical precision, statistics on racial disparities in arrests, recordings of officers using racial slurs, and testimony from victims of profiling. Each piece of evidence chipped away at the department's facade of integrity. When it was the defense's turn, their arguments were weak, their attempts to discredit the evidence transparently desperate. Evelyn's rulings were swift and unyielding, her gavel striking down objections with finality. Finally, she delivered her verdict. This court finds the Crestwood Police Department guilty of systemic misconduct and a failure to uphold the rights of the citizens it serves. Officers Daniels and Harris are hereby terminated, their certifications revoked, and their actions referred for criminal prosecution. Additionally, the department will undergo a complete overhaul, including mandatory bias training, external oversight, and a review of all prior arrests. The gallery erupted in applause, but Evelyn raised a hand, silencing the room. This is not a victory, she said, her voice heavy with emotion. It is a reckoning, and it is only the beginning. True justice requires vigilance, accountability, and the courage to confront our failures. Let this be a reminder that no one is above the law. As she left the bench, the weight of the moment settled over her. Outside, the sun was shining, its warmth a stark contrast to the cold reality she had just confronted. Reporters swarmed, but Evelyn walked past them, her head held high. In the days that followed, her ruling became a catalyst for change, inspiring similar reforms across the country. But for Evelyn, the fight was personal. She had stared injustice in the face and refused to blink. And though the road ahead was long, she knew one thing for certain: she would never stop fighting for what was right.